Susan Makes Sense on NBC4 is brought to you by Chase.
Welcome to Susan Makes Sense, and we are going to try to make sense of peptides. If you are curious about peptides, and who isn't these days, because if you are on social media, that's all anyone is talking about is peptides. You've got the Barbie peptide that makes you tan, the longevity peptide. Also, have you heard about something called the glow or anti-aging peptide? Kind of curious about that myself, to be honest with you. But we really wanted to do the show today because there's some really big news when it comes to peptides and how it could actually make peptides more accessible. There's an FDA review panel that met last week, so we're going to get into that and what that actually means going forward for the future of peptides. And also, before we get into all of that and who my guests are, and I'm really excited about you to meet my guest as well, one who's sitting next to me right here, I want to show you a story that I did that actually kind of breaks down what peptides are and what we're talking about. Let's see it. Peptides are exploding in popularity.
Why was I so late to the game on peptides? Like, everybody's doing them?
This is my first morning trying peptides.
From celebrities and influencers to suburban moms and even teens, millions are sharing their peptide stacks and jumping on the latest health craze.
These two peptides have changed my life. Let's talk about it.
So what exactly are peptides? Well, they're short chains of amino acids that act as biological messengers, sending instructions to cells and tissues involved in metabolism, tissue repair, hormone regulation, and immune response. Peptides can also be synthesized in a lab and injected by people who claim they help with building muscle, healing injuries, anti-aging, even delivering a sun-kissed tan without UV exposure. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been vocal about the benefits.
I've used them myself and used them with really good effect.
Now, under Kennedy's leadership, the FDA will decide whether to ease restrictions on some peptide injections. But Dr. Michelle Arthurs, a lifestyle medicine physician at Kaiser Permanente, worries the hype is outpacing the science.
The claims really are almost like superhero-like, right? They're marketed in a way that leads us into a seductive pathway of this is going to work for me no matter what, and I will have these results.
I mean, let's face it, we all want results. We all want to look younger. We all want to live forever. But, how safe and to what extent, are these peptides and should they be out there on the market in the first place? All of those questions we're going to be answering. And I want to bring in Patricia Fantis, who is actually my producer on this, that particular story that you just saw. But you and I have been going down really the rabbit hole with peptides. So I know that you have a lot of questions for our guest as well, who's joining us. So I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
You're welcome, Patricia. So I want to bring in Dr. Peter Lurie. He is a physician. He's a former senior FDA official. He's also the president right now of the Center for Science and the Public Interest. Dr. Lurie, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I think right out of the gate, for people who are just tuning in and may not know what happened last week on Thursday and Friday, there was an FDA review panel that met. Can you talk to us about that? What was the panel? Who was it? Who was on it? And what were they actually discussing? And what does it have to do with peptides?
So FDA is a whole elaborate system of what are called advisory committees. These are groups of external experts that the agency brings in periodically to get advice from people outside of FDA about how to handle some difficult scientific topic. So they have, several dozen of these. One of them is called the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee, if you can imagine that. And they advise the FDA on pharmacy compounding specifically. So what is pharmacy compounding? Pharmacy compounding is a kind of an exemption to the general food and drug laws in this country. What it allows is for individual pharmacists on behalf of individual patients to manufacture a drug that is specific for them. So a good example of this would be you have a pill, you have a patient who needs that pill, they can't swallow because they have some neurologic disease. The pharmacist will find a way to turn the pill into a liquid form that can be swallowed, and then that is a compounded form. You get a prescription from the doctor to that effect, and that's the way compounding is expected to work. What's here is that FDA, or the Department of Health and Human Services, which houses FDA, is now talking about allowing peptides to be compounded.
So the members of the review panel, who are they? Are they unbiased? Are they just scientists? Who are sitting on these panels to discuss the peptides?
So usually, another advisory committee, for example, might be FDA's Cardiovascular Drug Advisory Committee. Okay, so what they do is they find a bunch of cardiovascular experts, right, from around the country, typically from academia, and they find some of the best that they can, and then they put them on, and the various questions arise before them, and they vote. That's the usual way things are done. Unfortunately, that's really not what happened in this case. What happened was there were a number of vacancies on this committee. It hadn't met for a while, and so people had kind of fallen off the committee. And so HNA, Health and Human Services Secretary Kennedy saw this as an opportunity to put people that he liked on the committee and pick them, evidently, specifically for their positions on peptides. Most of these 8 have very strong connections to the peptide industry, and all of these 8, with one very minor exception, voted in favor of all of these peptides in each case. Whereas all of the other members of the committee, some that were left over from before and a few others that FDA added, voted in the opposite direction. In other words, what happened is the secretary stacked the committee in a certain direction, and the members of the committee that were appointed by him engaged in party line voting. That is not what we're used to seeing in science. In science, we get a much more honest back and forth in which people acknowledge their uncertainties. But what we get instead here is a much more politically driven process in which the secretary set it up for a certain outcome, and frankly, he got it.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me that came out of that panel discussion was everyone's talking about peptides and how popular they are, but there's no real long-term clinical study to talk about its safety and efficacy. Can you talk about that with what the questions are and the risks with peptides? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I've gone to a lot of these committees. I've sat on them. I've even put them together when I used to work at FDA. I've never seen a committee that was as biased as this one, that had as many conflicts with people who, were allowed to serve despite that. But in addition, I've never seen a more damning assessment of the safety and effectiveness of any set of drugs, much less 7 drugs. And so FDA's staff did go through, they dug up everything they possibly could find from the medical literature. They looked even at some other things that had been submitted to them by members of the public. And when you look at their assessment of the effectiveness of these products, there's just really nothing there. I mean, nothing that would convince a scientist of any rigor at all. I mean, in many instances, there are literally no human studies. Some cases, there are a few animal studies or a petri dish study here or there. When there are human studies, they're typically not properly designed in that they're not actually experiments, or in that they don't have placebo groups. And if you were going to the Cardiovascular Drug Advisory Committee that I referred to earlier, you would not be seeing studies that look like this. They would be, head and shoulders above the quality that the FDA was able to dig up. And so at the end of the day, the evidence was extremely shallow, and it's extraordinary to me that anybody who could sit on an FDA committee could have been compelled by them.
The other thing that we found really interesting in our investigation was that people who buy peptides off of whatever website, if they aren't sure and they want to make sure they got something safe, they can actually send it to a lab and they test that for them, right?
Right. We talked to BioTools co-founder who works with Finric, this company where you can basically send in your peptide stack, they test it, and they see what's actually in it. And it was really interesting because what they found was 30% of the vials that they tested, thousands of vials, 30% of them had substances that were overdosed in what they were saying, underdosed in what they were saying, didn't have the chemicals that they said that they had, or had live bacteria that could potentially land somebody in the hospital, which I thought was really surprising. And she said there's probably more now that they're testing more vials.
The quality of compounded drugs is often poor. And so, you're taking your life in your hands when you go and you go to one of these places or accept drugs from them. So the idea that things are going to become safe because they are somehow legal isn't actually true, as your investigation already shows. Moreover, as the advisory committee vote indicates, one can't rely on physicians to sort out the wheat from the chaff here. I mean, most of these folks have a financial interest in the way, in whether or not people get the product. And so the very people who are supposedly more scientifically oriented and wound up on the advisory committee reached a decision that almost any reputable scientist would decide is unjustified. But here's the kind of chutzpah of the whole thing. What's really being said here is that the folks who are the influencers here, which in effect includes the secretary, what they've done is created a bunch of demand. That is true. Selling things as research use only when you're not doing research is illegal, and that's what these people are doing. But what has happened is that the influencers created demand, and the chutzpah is that they now turn around to us and say, well, that demand has got so great that you have to legalize it. That's in effect what the argument is. And FDA simply can't succumb to that kind of argument. I mean, what if we were to do that for everything else illegal that somebody had managed to sell? All you have to do is drum up enough demand, and then FDA just has to roll over. I mean, that's basically to surrender its entire role in the drug approval process. We can't have that.
So I want you to yeah, go ahead.
Well, let me just add to that in the following way. One of the reasons, the way the drug approval process really works is that people have to generate data, right, which takes a lot of time and a lot of money, like hundreds of millions of dollars, okay? They do elaborate studies, which they submit to the FDA. And if the FDA decides that the product works, the drug gets approved, and what the company gets in exchange for all the work that they put on is a legal monopoly for a number of years on the sale of that product. That's where the money is to be made, okay? And so there has to be an incentive for people to actually do that work. Now, if instead we have a situation where these products are available willy-nilly all over the country in an unregulated fashion, producing the kind of poor quality stuff that your testing shows, then we'll never have any incentive to actually figure out whether or not these products work. And that's the biggest problem of all. I've got no objection to a properly proven peptide that is administered to patients once it's been FDA approved. That is fine with me, okay? But I need to know that it works first. And we will never find out because no one will have any incentive to develop these products properly. Because if you are a drug company and you know that there's already a whole market out there of people who can sell it, even without your efforts to get it approved, you are not going to be developing that drug. Why would you do that? Because your monopoly will have been destroyed before you even come in. And that's part of the problem. So the result here is that the entirety of the drug approval process is literally at risk here. If people can simply create enough demand and then the FDA has to turn a blind eye, we will lose the drug approval process that has served this country so well.
Some people would argue that the drug approval process takes billions of dollars, years to get through. So isn't there, some sort of a workaround, or was this kind of like the peptide industry a wake-up call to say, well, maybe we need to step up the process to make it quicker so things like these don't get on the gray market and are being sold and for research purposes only, and people are buying them?
Yeah, no, I understand that. And of course, the sooner we can identify products as effective and bring them to patients, the better. In fact, the number of months that it takes FDA to approve a drug has dropped by well over 50% in the last decade or two. And in fact, and here's the thing that people mostly don't understand, if you were to look at all of the new drugs that come on the market in the last several years, anywhere in the world, 2/3 of them came on the market first in the United States. Okay? Now, there are 200 countries in the world, and any one of them could have beaten us to it. But in 2/3 of the cases, we got there first. That's extraordinary. So there's no case to be made that FDA is slower than Europe or slower than Mexico. It's simply just not the case. In any case, even if there is a product that is properly being developed by a drug company, and there is a patient with a serious or life-threatening illness who would like access to the drug, FDA, in fact, has a process that allows people to get access to it. It's called expanded access. About 1,000 people a year, sometimes more, get access to products that way. But these people are not dealing with serious or life-threatening illnesses. They're dealing with illnesses that are, that are ill-defined in many cases, that have FDA-approved cures. Can we just not forget that as well? I mean, one of the costs of peptides is that people will take them instead of something that's proved to work. I mean, that's a terrible outcome. And that's part of what will happen when these things become more widely available.
So Dr. Lurie, I want you to listen to a portion of an interview that I had with, his name is Dr. Alex Tatum. He's a board-certified urologist. He's a men's health specialist, and he is widely known as the peptide expert. So he admitted to us that, yes, I do prescribe these to my patients. He says he wants the FDA to approve them so they can get off the gray market and into the hands of responsible doctors. I want you to hear a soundbite from him, and then we'll come back to you on the other side.
It's going to be like Black Friday. Like, we're going to open up, the floodgates, and compounding pharmacies are going to be drowning. They're not going to be able to fill all the orders. And obviously, you have to have the ingredients to make the medication. And so what they have to do is they have to build up stockpiles of what's called APIs. These are, again, think of these as the ingredients, like the ingredients you would have to make a recipe in the kitchen. These are ingredients to make medications. And so not only do they have to stockpile these ingredients, they also have to try and all agree on the best way to make these. And there's actually a formal body working on that called the American Academy of Peptide Sciences, which is trying to come up with very formal, what are called monographs for exactly what should BPC 157 look like. And can we all come to one agreement? So that way, hey, the BPC 157 I get from this compounding pharmacy in Texas is identical to this one in Indiana. And so patients can have that confidence, because more importantly than just getting access to these peptides, we want to make sure that we're doing this in a uniform, controlled, safe fashion, making sure we're getting the same product every time, and simultaneously collecting information about these peptides so that we can document safety, so we can reassure the public and reassure officials, so hopefully we don't lose access to these medications ever again.
So, Dr. Lurie, I mean, sounds like it makes perfect sense.
Well, not really. I mean, here's the problem. One of the things that the FDA reviews established is that all of the compounding advocates for peptides are unable to actually describe what it is that they are what they are compounding. They literally cannot describe it. The studies that are out there, it's BPC 157 acetate versus the base. And when you ask, well, which one is it that is set to work, nobody can answer. There was one other of these peptides that comes up. Question that the advisory committee member asked was, well, it says it should be 0.1% topical. So is that 0.1% by weight, or is it 0.1% by volume? FDA goes, well, we have no way of knowing. They say, well, is it the base or is it the acetate? No, well, we have no way of knowing. Is it a cream or is it a gel, an ointment? We have no way of knowing. So in other words, there's no standardization of this whatsoever. And that is the absolute task one of drug development, is you have to be able to figure out what it is that you think you're using and be able to make it consistently. These people can't do that. They fall at step one in the process.
But isn't that what Dr. Tatum was saying, though, is to let's make it a standard, so they are all on, they're all making the same formula.
He can say that, but they don't. They haven't. And the history of compounding tells us that they will make these chemicals in all likelihood as poorly as they made the previous set of compounded chemicals, right? As documented in your research, and as we have seen in a series of outbreaks related to contamination of compounded products. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, and I worked at FDA when we had a terrible event in which hundreds, literally 600 or 700 people ended up getting infected with a mold in their spinal columns because a compounding pharmacy didn't know how to make a steroid properly. And 70 odd people died. I mean, it is serious. And many of these products are intended to be used by injection. I mean, topical is one thing. FDA sometimes allows those things to be compounded, but as soon as you start talking about by injection into a part of the body that is supposed to be sterile, the stakes go up. And I have no confidence that these people would be able to make it properly. But again, even if they could, it doesn't mean it works. And no amount of influencer testimony, no amount of enthusiasm from your doctor or anybody else can make up for what the FDA couldn't find, which was reasonable scientific evidence of effectiveness for any of these.
I agree with you. I think one of the things that came up, though, too, is this desperation from people who are just desperate for some sort of treatment to deal with pain or insomnia or brain fog or just wanting to look and feel their best. And so these peptides seem to be like a potential solution for them. Can you talk about the 6 peptides that were recommended for approval, what each of them does and doesn't do?
Well, as I said, they don't do anything as far as anybody's able to prove. Okay. What they're supposed to do is a different question. And very often, by the way, the compounding people are selling and prescribing and profiting from these products for reasons that FDA wasn't even able to evaluate because there's literally no data whatsoever. So, the big one is BPC 157, which is all about wound healing, according to the secretary, right? But in fact, the only available data relate to ulcerative colitis, something completely different. And in fact, all there was in this particular case was one abstract, right? That means 250 words that was never published in a proper medical journal, and in any case did not establish the effectiveness of BPC 157 for ulcerative colitis anyway. So look, I get it. People get conditions in which they are not getting the cure that they wished, and that's a really difficult situation. And, my heart goes out to them when that's the situation. But a solution to that problem is not to give them stuff that is being made poorly in many instances and has not been shown to work. What we should do is keep working on trying to find out what it is that does. And that may or may not be a peptide. These people are very focused on peptides, and some peptides are among the most important drugs in American medicine, like insulin, for example, or all these recent weight loss drugs. They're all peptides. So, there's nothing inherent about peptides except for the mystique that the influencers have created. But they're tested in the same way as every other peptide or non-peptide drug. You have to go out, you have to figure out what is in the compound, you have to identify it in a reproducible way, you have to make a product that contains it, in a consistent fashion, and then you have to go and give it to thousands of people, usually for months, if not years, in order to establish if it really works. And those drugs that survive that gauntlet are the ones that are helping American patients today. These products, there's no evidence that anybody's being helped except for those people who are profiting from them.
So where do we go from here? Because the head of the HHS who, says he uses them, says it works. You've got a lot of people out there who are online on social media saying it has made them feel better. They look better. And there's all of that noise going on out there. So is there a future for these types of peptides, period?
Well, there is a future, and it's the boring one that I just described, right? Which is that for those that really look promising, and I just want to say parenthetically that if I were a drug company and we're looking at the 7 that came before FDA, I wouldn't see a whole lot of reason to go and invest, $100 million in it because the evidence is so thin at this point. But some drug company might do that. And if that were the case, and they want to sink $100 million into it and hope that the product actually works, good luck to them. And I hope that they turn out that their hunch pays off. That's what I hope. I really do. But, my guess is that most of these compounders will never do any kind of reasonable study. Your informant here can talk about it, but between them, with all these years of using all of these products, they haven't come up with anything worthwhile so far. So why should it be different next year? There's no reason to. These people are not scientifically oriented. They're profit oriented. That's what's driving them. And so they'll keep selling it, whether or not they're data. Now, where the government can step in, if it wishes to, and since the secretary sits over NIH as well, he could order the NIH to go and do some actual placebo-controlled trials on the most promising of these peptides, and maybe we'd actually learn something. But what I'm telling you is that these things go into compounding. The studies will not be done. In all likelihood, no reputable pharmaceutical company will ever take them up, and they will continue to be provided to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people without any evidence of benefit or a realistic prospect of ever finding out if they do any good.
So I want to kind of start wrapping this up because I want to understand, though. So the FDA, these are not approved. These have not been approved yet. Right. So the FDA still has to meet based on the recommendations from this panel. Then they decide whether to approve or not to approve this to go forward. What is your gut telling you? You served in the FDA for years. So what do you think is going to happen, and how quickly does this happen? How quickly does this vote happen?
So let's just be clear on the word approved for a moment.
Okay.
There's approved as a drug, as a general matter, like insulin or ibuprofen, what have you. These products are not that. What's at issue at the advisory committee is whether or not these unapproved drugs would be approved for compounding. That's what the question was. And so that's what we're waiting to hear. And that's what the advisors voted generally 8-6, that they should be. So what happens next is that FDA has to take into account everything that it heard at the advisory committee hearing, people who spoke at it, like including me and many others on the other side of this issue. They take into account any submissions that people might have made to the docket. And based on that, if they want to, they can issue what's called a proposed rule, in which they can propose that whichever of these 7 substances now get added to the list that can be compounded. If that happens, if they do that, then the public gets to comment again, in which they can say, yes, we agree with that proposal, or we don't. And then finally, the FDA issues a final rule. And if the final rule says you can compound them, then you can. So that's a process that usually takes a number of years. My guess is it'll move faster here. But the real nub of the question is how it is that Health and Human Services, or FDA for that matter, can reach a conclusion that these products can be compounded when their career staff went and reviewed all of them and concluded that they couldn't. Now, I don't know how that's done. Okay. I mean, you've got a group of people who might have to be writing a report that contradicted what they just said. Are they going to be willing to do that? Is the secretary going to overrule them? Ordinarily, there'd be no question of this. In ordinary circumstances, the secretary would have no interest in so minor a question as what can be placed, on the pharmacy compounding list. That is just not something a secretary concerns himself with.
Yeah.
But this secretary is different.
Yeah, and to what Patricia said too, the concern that I have, and just hearing my 20-somethings all talking about it too, my kids, is that the desperate, their people want to live longer. They want to look better. They want to be tan. They want to have their, Achilles tendon healed faster so they can go back out and running. And when you hear the secretary of HHS saying that it's worked for him, I mean, what is it to stop people from continuing to buy these off of the gray market, right?
No, absolutely. But personally, I want many of those things, maybe not all of them, but I want most of those things you just listed. But I also am not going to put into my body something that hasn't been shown to do those things. And that's where we are. This is a set of products that haven't been shown to do this. And we're asking people to, work off the basis of financially driven speculation, right? By the influences here. I don't fall for stuff like that. And frankly, I hope that the American public doesn't either.
I mean, I think a concern from doctors too is, does this open a Pandora's box when it comes to other unproven drugs and treatments down the road?
Absolutely. And that's the very premise of FDA, right? The premise of FDA is that pharmaceutical drugs offer both such promise and such risk that we need people who can evaluate them before they come to market. Okay, we don't ask that for my tea kettle, right? That we think people can make a reasonable decision for themselves. But it turns out that most decisions about what works and doesn't in medicine are a bit more complicated than that. And so we defer customarily in this country and every other developed country in the world to a group of people who have the proper training, experience, know how to interpret the data, and have some degree of skepticism before they allow people who have not been trained to make those kinds of assessment, and that includes almost all of those influencers, that those people will make an assessment, frankly, on our behalf, and they will protect us, those that are ineffective or dangerous.
Yeah.
So that is something I think that is delivered well for American patients, and we should really try to safeguard it.
Yeah. Final question from Patricia. I know she has something to ask you.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting during the panel discussion was the testimony from these telehealth companies who were saying, yep, they want to be on board too. They want to start selling these peptides. And that's a criticism that a lot of people have. These telehealth companies don't have very much interaction, if any at all, with patients once they give the prescription. Can you talk about the potential danger with that?
Yeah, well, yes, of course. And they're obviously profit driven as well. So, of course, they want them to be compounded. And the more choices they can offer, the more money they'll make. So that makes sense. The thing about the telehealth is that, at its worst, at least, it makes a mockery of the way compounding is supposed to work in the first place. So I mentioned earlier, you're supposed to have a unique prescription from a particular physician who has examined you for your particular needs. That's the sort of essence of what compounding is supposed to be. So once you get to this place where you have telehealth people who are not engaging in physical exams, that's not always necessary, right? But there's no physical exam, and who have a financial incentive to determine that indeed you do meet the criteria for prescribing, then you've got a problem. And occasionally you have state medical boards. And by the way, most of the regulation of these pharmacies, that compound, is not done by FDA. It's done by the states, who are even more poorly resourced than the FDA. But setting that aside, what you have is occasionally you have the states go after these telehealth companies because their so-called examination is just really pro forma. And that's definitely something that any patient should want to be skeptical of. If you can get the drug, at the drop of a hat from a telehealth company, I would be very wary of that.
Well, Dr. Lurie, thank you so much for joining us, for giving us a lot of perspective on this. It answered a lot of my questions. I know Patricia's as well. For the person who's tuning in who thought they were going to learn about how to get tan on a peptide, I think that there's thinking to themselves, oh, man, crap, that's probably not the best idea. But thank you so much for helping us learn a thing or two about this. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
I think thanks, Dr. Lurie. Back to just you and me. I mean, you and I talk about this stuff all the time. I mean, we get it. I mean, everyone's
talking about peptides,
right? Yeah. And I get the draw for that, and I'm sure for as I said, for the people who are watching, probably think, oh, this is about peptides, and where can I get it, and how good are they, and how well they work. I think Dr. Lurie made me kind of feel like. Like maybe they're not, you got to kind of stop and sit and wait for the process. But a lot of people don't want to.
Yeah. And I think for the people who are taking peptides, they're going to keep taking them.
Yeah.
But I think this opens up your eyes into the potential for what it could mean down the road, long term.
Right.
Just gives you more information to think about.
I agree. Well, thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Thanks, Susan.
Trial by fire. Poor Patricia. I literally asked her like 10 minutes before. I'm like, do you want to do this?
I'm like, okay, here I am.
You have so many questions too. I mean, you were just as much part of the story as I was. And we just, we had a lot of questions for you.
Yeah. And it's a new treatment. And so you don't know a lot about it. And so it's great to hear from people like Dr. Lurie and others about what they know and what they don't know.
Right. And let us know in the comments, too. We really would love to hear from you. Have you ever used peptides? And if you have, which ones have you used and has it worked for you? I think having this conversation and opening up the comments, I think can help a lot of people as well. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all the things. And of course, we will see you next time.